This video is intended for entertainment and historical purposes only. It's not meant to be an instructional tutorial or provide professional advice. When Jim Walsh arrived to recover the remains of the derelict little Davenport, he found something that was closer in appearance to a dilapidated garden shed than a locomotive, peacefully waiting to be put out of its misery. When the engine was converted from steam to gas, the miners built an all-weather cab to protect the gas engine and locomotive operator from the harsh and rainy environment. Being Alaska, they used what was on hand, which resulted in a very unique appearance. Sometime around 1960, the little railroad gave way to trucks, and the miners used machinery to literally shove the locomotive sideways off its tracks and into the ditch next to the right-of-way. It sat like this until Jim found it some 20 years later. Recognizing its potential, a deal was struck with the mine, and Jim went to work dismantling the wood cab and locating the engine's missing pieces. Most of the parts were found strewn around the site, with the forest slowly overtaking them. Once everything was located, the parts and pieces were moved to the beach on homemade log skids. They were then transferred to a barge for shipment south and onto a brighter future. After the trip home from Alaska, Jim only loosely assembled the boiler, tank, and running gear back together, but I suspected separating the boiler from the frame may be challenging due to the left frame rail being slightly bent, probably due to being pushed into the ditch back in 1960. To compensate for this, I decided to gently jack the frame rails apart and then jack the boiler up a couple inches. Even with the jack holding the frame rails apart, the left side wanted to stay tight against the boiler. This was partially due to the damaged left furnace bearer studs resting on the frame. The right side studs were in much better condition and didn't give the same trouble. As I jacked up the boiler from the firebox, there were a couple things happening. First, the spring rigging was lifting the frame as the boiler's weight was taken by the jacks. Then, as the back of the boiler went higher, more weight was distributed to the front of the engine through the smoke box. This caused the front of the engine to nose down a little due to the weight of the cylinder casting, lifting the rear set of drivers an inch or so off the rail. After a few more minutes of jacking, I was confident that the firebox end of the boiler was high enough in the frame rails to not cause any problems during the lift. It was blocked, but the jack holding the frame rails apart was left in place, just in case. At that point, I moved on to the front of the boiler. If you look closely, you can see the tilted angle of the running gear and the number 2 driver set just slightly above the rail. As I start jacking, you can see the rear of the frame and the back driver set settle back into a normal stance. It was the same goal here. Jack the front end up just enough to confirm nothing was hanging up and ensure there wouldn't be any issues when we lifted the boiler with the backhoe. Once the boiler was high enough, blocks were placed across the frame rails and across the cylinder saddle. The boiler was then lowered onto the blocks and the jacks removed. At this point, we were fully prepared to bring the backhoe in and lift the boiler off the frame itself. The decision was made to lift the boiler and saddle tank in one go using a spreader bar. This method should prevent the lifting straps from rubbing and doing any damage to the tank. Unfortunately, I don't have any spreader bars longer than the locomotive saddle tank, but what I do have is timber. After doing a quick calculation to ensure our 6x8 timber spreader bar had a sufficient margin of safety for the weight we were about to lift, we started to position the backhoe. I wanted the center point for the lift to be directly above the steam dome, meaning that each fork would be on opposite sides of the steam dome, and the center point of the spreader bar would be directly above the steam dome. This was a bit fiddly, and it took a little bit of jockeying with the backhoe, but eventually we got it perfectly positioned. I decided to use lifting straps to lift the boiler rather than chains, mostly just because I didn't want to damage my wood spreader bar. As the boilers lifted, the chains would have dug into the wood and caused a bit of damage. It probably wouldn't have hurt anything too bad, but why damage good timber if you don't have to? The lifting straps have more than enough capacity, being rated at close to 6,000 pounds each. And this boiler and tank really don't weigh that much, contrary to how they look. With everything rigged and ready to go, the backhoe slowly and gently started to lift, the straps stretching under the weight of the boiler. As soon as the boiler started to lift an eighth of an inch or a quarter of an inch, we stopped everything and did one final double check. After confirming that nothing was hanging up, all the straps were looking good, nothing was rubbing where it shouldn't be rubbing, the beam looked good, nothing was bending or twisting, and our calculations were all correct. The last thing to do was confirm with the backhoe operator that he knew the plan. Now, time to lift. With the boiler up in the air and free of its frame rails for the first time in 44 years, we removed the jack holding the two frame rails apart. It was no longer necessary, and its handle might catch the boiler as we backed away. The boiler was then taken away to another area of the storage yard, where it's going to sit for the immediate future. Very accessible to take measurements or get parts off of it, generally out of the way. Now that we've got this excitement out of the way, and since you were kind enough to stick around to the very end of the video, I think it's only fair I give you a little sneak peek to what we're going to be doing next episode. In my first video, there is a little Easter egg if you look hard enough. That Easter egg will give you an idea of what my ultimate goal is. And this goal takes a couple things. But I'll tell you more about that next episode. Thanks for watching.